Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our October Fusatsu, our atonement ceremony. And as I look around the room, I think most of you have done a number of Fusatsus, but there are a couple of you who haven't done maybe only one. And online, I think most of you have done it, but maybe a couple of people for whom it's new. I'm not going to say too much about the ceremony itself, but I did want to call your attention to the beginning. At the beginning, we chant the verse of atonement, and we recognize that we are not separate from all evil karma that's ever been committed on account of our greed, anger, and ignorance, born of our body, mouth, and thought. And so this recognition is not something that we do intellectually. In this ceremony, we engage with it directly. And the way we do that is through our body, mouth, and thoughts. We engage with it and we atone for it and are at one with it through the bowing and the chanting and the attention that we pay during the ceremony. And just in that engagement, we are completely connected with it, without any kind of separation created in our minds. And then once we've done that, we have the next part of the ceremony where we connect with all of the different manifestations of the enlightened mind that we call Buddha. The spirit of compassion, the spirit of wisdom, the spirit of vow and service, all the different manifestations of Buddha, enlightened mind. And again, we don't do that intellectually, we do it directly and experientially. How? By letting go of our thoughts and just giving ourselves whole body and mind to the bowing and the chanting and attention to liturgy. And it's right there. And then the next stage, having acknowledged our oneness, our at one-ment with the enlightened mind, we say the vows of the Bodhisattva vows to be of service in the world and to wake up. And again, we do it through wholehearted and whole body engagement and attention. So really, in the ceremony, all you have to do is bow and chant and pay attention, and it's all right there. It's all, you can atone for it all and be at one with it all. It's actually very simple. Seems like maybe a fancy liturgical thing, but it's actually a very simple process. And then that takes us to this part of the ceremony where we reflect briefly on the precepts, which are our ethical guidelines that can help us to fulfill our bodhisattva vows. So in my small corner of the universe, there are a couple of luminaries who just passed away. 2 days ago, it was Mike Davis. Mike Davis, some of you might know, was a writer from Southern California, working class background. He ended up writing, being a public intellectual who wrote on all sorts of different topics, from the history of the American labor movement to a great book on the history and political economy and culture of Los Angeles. He wrote a book on famine in South Asia under British colonialism, another book on the car bomb. So he had his critics, and the critics tended to say he's very apocalyptic and kind of a doomsday thinker. But others saw kind of a prophetic side, because his writing in some ways anticipated the 1992 uprising in Los Angeles after the beating of Rodney King. in some ways, his writings anticipated all of the ecological disasters involving wildfires in Southern California and beyond, with the encroachment of urban settlement in areas where it really was not very wise. He wrote a book on the epidemiological disaster that would be to come. Again, having to do with the destabilization of older patterns of human settlement and relationship with nature. And at the end of his life, he gave an interview, and someone asked him, the journalist said, the act of organizing seems to rest on hope for changing the world. But your books paint a grim picture: ecological collapse, political corruption, white supremacy, the continuing immiseration of the global poor. How do you hold on to hope? And he said, I don't think that people fight or stay the course because of hope. I think people do it out of love and anger. Mm. And that struck me. The other person who passed away last month was Barbara Ehrenreich, another person of working class family background, a lifelong socialist and feminist, who wrote on a wide variety of topics. Her best known book is Nickel and Dimed, where she worked for a time in the minimum wage sector to get a sense for what it was like, firsthand sense for what it was like, and how people could make things meet. And what she found is they couldn't. It's impossible to subsist off of the minimum wage when she wrote her book. And she did other projects like that. She also did one in which she tried to get a job in a sort of mid-level white-collar career called bait and switch. And she found it was impossible to get a job. And the whole book points to the insecurity of sort of middle-class, mid-level, white-collar professionals, the deep labor insecurity there. She wrote on other topics. One book is on the manifestations of collective joy. It wasn't all bummers and downsides. But in the tributes to Barbara Ehrenreich, a lot of people pointed to the fact that anger was actually one of the really motivating things in her work. And she felt it was a key component of political activism and any kind of movement for political change. Her fighting spirit, part of it was coming from the anger that she felt over the indignities and abuses and injustices that people experience personally and collectively. She also wrote a book. The title is Bright-Sided: How Positive Thinking is Undermining America. And it was triggered by her own breast cancer diagnosis, and she was having these wellness experts tell her that she should just accept everything that was happening to her, and she should treat her cancer as a gift. And if she was not looking at it in a positive way, she was essentially contributing to her own sickness. And that really pissed her off. So I've been struck in recent years, more and more I hear this term negative emotions. You hear that? And I think, what does that mean? Why would an emotion be either positive or negative? An emotion is just what arises naturally based on what's going on, the causes and conditions. But now there's this idea that certain emotions like anger or sadness are negative and we have to stay away from them. Ehrenreich's book talked about how there's a whole culture, a whole industry that's developed around self-help and New Age stuff that uses being positive as a way to get people away from their true feelings of anger or of sadness. And so in the corporate world, for example, it's a way to create pliancy and obedience in the labor force. But what's the problem with anger? I mean, anger, if we look at it from the perspective of Master Dogen and his our study text, Komyo, Radiant Light, or Koen Eijo's study text, Komyozo Sanmai. Anger is just the radiant light. Anger is just Buddha light. If we think that spiritual life is about putting on angel wings and a smiley face, that too is Buddha light, but it's, in a way, it's really Buddha light, L-I-T-E, all right? L-I-T-E. If we think it's about putting on angel wings and a smiley face, we're never going to be able to help ourselves and help other people when faced with the reality of suffering. And when we're faced with the reality of suffering, anger arises very naturally. And so that's true, I think, personally, and it's true collectively. And Mike Davis and Barbara Ehrenreich point to the fact that social movements throughout history have always been fueled by anger. Social change happens because there is indignation. Sometimes the movements are progressive, sometimes they're reactionary, but the anger is a big part of it. And that's something that we have to look at. I was remembering that, I think it was in the late 80s, someone told me a story about someone they knew who was an activist in South Africa. And they worked with the ANC to bring down the apartheid government there. And what this guy did is he would go into the townships and work with young Black men to generate opposition and generate protests. And the way they did that was by stirring up anger. And he said it was actually not hard to do at all. And it was very effective politically. But he had qualms about it because he also realized that they weren't working with these young men to train them to be able to contain anger or to be able to channel anger. And so it was a very double-edged sword. And he knew that there were problems and costs that resulted from it. So this is the point I wanted to bring up tonight, and that is, how do we square the importance of anger that people like Mike Davis or Barbara Ehrenreich point to with the Buddhist teachings about anger, and in particular, the 9th grave precept of not being angry. So remember that in Buddhism, there are 3 poisons: greed, anger, and ignorance. And that's why I pointed to the beginning of our ceremony. We say all evil karma ever committed because of our greed, anger, and ignorance. Those are the 3 poisons. Evil karma, meaning the actions that produce suffering. And if we look at the 9th grave precept of not being angry, the first way to approach it is very straightforward, very literal way, which I think is basically about having the capacity to restrain yourself when you're angry, having the ability to refrain from acting out of anger. So I think it's helpful to reframe it, the precept, not as not being angry, but not indulging in anger, because anger arises naturally, causes and conditions. But how do we deal with it? And so the first basic way to deal with it is by developing the capacity to contain it or to restrain yourself if you need to. If you don't have that education or training or practice to help you do it, then if we think of again about young men, the easiest thing is you pick up a gun and you shoot the person who makes you upset, right? Or maybe it's not just kids, maybe it's an adult that just picks up the gun and shoots whoever is upsetting them. Or maybe it doesn't take a gun, but to lash out in one way or another against a partner or a child or an employee or a stranger. It's so easy to go from anger to conflict to violence to great suffering, unless we have some kind of practice, some kind of education that allows us to restrain ourselves when we need to. The second approach is not so straightforward. It's a little more subtle. It's a little more flexible, recognizing that the appropriate response in any given situation will depend upon circumstances, the time and place, the relationships in that situation, the degree to which you respond. And from this perspective, anger, again, is not intrinsically positive or negative or good or bad. In fact, anger is an energy that can actually be used very constructively and maybe to diminish suffering or to be of benefit. So continuing with the theme of young men and boys, I remember when I was about 12 years old, I was at the local high school campus with some friends. It was a weekend, so there was no one around, we thought. And we decided it would be fun to pick up the chalk rock there and see how far we could chuck it and see if we could get it over the area, fenced-in area where the swimming pool was. Sometimes we didn't make it, and the rocks would kind of skid around in the pool area or land on the roof of the building next to the pool area. And we were having a good time when suddenly this little man came storming out of the building next to the pool area. And he came marching up straight at us and planted himself in front of us. And I felt like he was looking straight at me the whole time. And I could see this storm brewing on his brow. And then he just let loose. He lit into us ferociously and cursed lots of blue language. You fucking punks, you idiots, what do you think you're doing? I was just frozen. My jaw dropped. No one had ever spoken to me like that before, and it really registered deeply. If he had just called out from the building, hey, knock it off, or he'd come over and said, now, children, yeah, well, I know you're having a good time, but this is not a very prudent, it would have made no impression on me. But this made a real impression on me. I still see the whole thing vividly. And curiously enough, a few years later, I went to high school, and this guy became my mentor. I would go and read books with him. He introduced me to meditation, and he said, one day, Zen is going to be a very important reference for you. So yeah, I think the problem is not anger in and of itself. It's when we latch onto certain ideas that come up in our anger, and we string them together into some kind of narrative, or fit them into some kind of ideology that locks us into a kind of box that we can't see ourselves out of. and we're just stuck there. And then there's no alternative but to lash out. But that's not the only possibility. And again, our practice and this precept, if we handle it flexibly, can help us to stay present in the midst of our anger. Even as the flames are flaring up, we can still be aware of ourselves and be aware of our situation. And if we're able to do that, it gives us some leeway. It gives us some ability to act or not act, depending on what's more skillful or maybe more helpful or not. So if we can do that, we can see ourselves. If we don't do that, the anger is just blind, and the damage is inevitable. So I think that ability to see ourselves individually or collectively is what Mike Davis and Barbara Ehrenreich are talking about, to see our situation and be able to respond in the midst of anger, respond appropriately. Maybe it's shutting up, or maybe it's disciplining a child. Maybe it's speaking up, speaking honestly. But we can do that more appropriately with practice. There is a third approach to the precept, and that is if we let go of all of our prejudices and our ideas and just feel the energy in our bodies, in our hearts, the energy of that situation, then we can flow with it, and we can move with it, and we can act naturally, just naturally, according to what's going on. And then it's not even, you can't even put a label on it like anger or not being angry or not indulging in anger. You can't, it's not about refraining from anything, restraining yourself. It's not about discriminating between good or evil or right or wrong or skillful or unskillful. It's just acting freely and naturally in the moment. There's no precept even. And so, yeah. Bodhidharma looks at this precept from this perspective, the absolute perspective. And he says, in the realm of the selfless Dharma, not contriving reality for the self is called the precept of not indulging in anger. Not contriving reality for the self. And Master Dogen puts it even more beautifully. He says about this precept of not indulging in anger, really listen to these words. I think they're amazing. He says, not advancing, not retreating, not real, not empty. There is an ocean of brightly illumined clouds. There is an ocean of solemn clouds. And that's how we are. We're like clouds. We don't have any fixed set nature. But when circumstances produce it, we flare up and we glow red with the sun. Or if the lights go out, we are dark, like the solemn clouds. So, just to shut up maybe, or just to storm over and give a child a good talking to march and chant in the streets against the injustices that we see, or to write down your opinion or express it to a family member or friend or stranger as you see it. let go of thoughts, wholehearted engagement, body and mind. And fuck the angel wings and fuck the smiley faces.